Thanks for waiting. Sorry, we're running on pothead time. We wanted to give everybody a little time to get here. I just had a fabulous conversation with our first speaker, which is another reason why we might be running a little late, so I apologize. I voted for our next speaker, so I'm thrilled to meet him in person. He's just as awesome as I thought he would be. Probably the first MP we've had in Vapor Central, as far as we know, wink, wink. There's some dark corners in here. Nathaniel Erskine-Smith is our first speaker, our keynote speaker for today. I did want to just remind everyone that this is streaming live on POT TV, and so if you come up in this area, you will be on camera, and it will be there in the archive. So if you miss any of this, or if you have to leave and miss the speakers that are on later in the day, you can access that on pottv.com. So Nathaniel attended Queen's University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in political science and a Juris Doctor in 2010. After Queen's, he studied political philosophy and constitutional law at Oxford, where he earned a Master's of Laws. When he returned to Toronto, he began to work as a commercial litigator while also working pro bono with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. In 2015, Nathaniel was elected as Member of Parliament, and at 31 became the youngest MP elected from the Greater Toronto Area, which is so cool. Since being elected, he has served as the president of the Canadian Group of Interparliamentary Union for a one-year term, and currently serves as the vice chair on the Standing Committee of Access to Information, Privacy, and Ethics. So tell this guy anything. I mean, he's the guy to trust. Nathaniel has previously introduced a private member's bill, C246, that sought to ban the import of shark fins and toughen Canada's animal cruelty laws, which is something he's also very passionate about. I think he has a speech later today on that topic as well. So everybody, please welcome to Vapor Central, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith.
And we're good? We're good with one of these? Maybe yes, maybe yes. Hello? Perfect. Okay, so I have a few remarks, and I'm certainly open to having a bit of a conversation as well about the federal perspective, and I know the province of Ontario just made a major announcement recently, which we can talk about as well. I wanted to start, though, by recognizing the efforts of NORML. We now see legalization debated on the front pages of newspapers, and it's kind of incredible to see that when a lot of NORML's work over the years has been in the wilderness, political wilderness, and so to really see how quickly things have moved over the last few years is pretty incredible, I think, and a lot of that work and the success of that work, I think, credit goes to NORML. I remember reading when I was an undergraduate student about the work of John Conroy, and I certainly thought more positively about pursuing work as a lawyer because of the advocacy efforts of his advocacy efforts. So I really just want to talk a little bit about where we are, how we got here, and where we're going, and successes in advocacy, failures in advocacy, and where we ought to focus advocacy efforts going forward, or where there are opportunities to pursue change going forward. And so really this tracks back when we're talking so I'm a Liberal Member of Parliament, so when we're talking about the initiative that the government has put forward, you now hear the government repeatedly say this is about removing profits from organized crime and about restricting access to kids. Of course, it actually started out as a Young Liberal of Canada policy resolution, and then became a Liberal Party of Canada policy resolution, and it talked about, that particular resolution talked a little bit about freedom, talked a little bit about the congestion in our criminal justice system and the unfairness of giving people criminal records. It talked about, yes, removing profits from organized crime, and talked about just the failure of prohibition, which we can talk about the failure of prohibition more broadly, and I'd be happy to have that conversation because I think we are pursuing failed policies on other fronts as well in the face of an opioid crisis. But certainly this particular policy resolution focused on the failure of prohibition as it relates to cannabis. So that's where we began, and our Prime Minister, who originally, I think, was more partial to decriminalization, was convinced that legalization, in fact, was the right answer, that decriminalization was only a half measure, and we need to pursue full legalization regulation. So success in advocacy, and we now have legislation that is going to be debated this fall. And if people have concerns or questions about that legislation, there are two parts to it. One is the legalization, the Cannabis Act, and then there is another act that deals with driving offenses, which I think there are some legitimate questions and concerns there. So failures in advocacy. I have a particular failure. By the way, just by way of my background, so I am a commercial litigation lawyer, or was before politics. When I was at Oxford, I studied Section 7 of our charter and studied specifically 3 issues: assisted dying, prostitution. So we have a Bedford case, is what it was called, at the Supreme Court, when they struck down the prostitution laws. We have Carter, where the laws were struck down related to assisted dying, and then also studied Section 7 as it relates to cannabis control, and specifically Melmo Levine. And my thought at the time was we were going to see the old prostitution reference overturned. We were going to see the old Rodriguez case, which was assisted dying, overturned. And I actually think if you look at other jurisdictions that decriminalized cannabis, and you didn't see a noticeable uptick in usage rates, I thought there was a plausible argument that Melmo Levine would be overturned for decriminalization purposes. So I am fairly familiar with the case law, and had a bit of a background by way of those studies. So when I became an MP, and I certainly felt that the current system was unjust as it relates to certainly imposing, if not prison sentences, criminal records, and just interaction with the justice system at all for simple possession particularly, I asked that we stop arresting people. My advocacy efforts were met with some failure, that the law is the law is the law. So I tried even a sort of a workaround, and got research to show that we could actually have a ministerial directive issued. We couldn't stop arrests per se if the law was the law, but we could stop pursuing these cases in court. And we could issue a directive to Crown Counsel not to pursue these cases. That advocacy effort was also met with failure. I ended up being the only Liberal member of Parliament to stand up in the House and vote for decriminalization, immediate decriminalization, obviously in favor of full legalization down the road. So that, I would say, as people continue to receive records, or at the very least charges, and there are tens of thousands that have been charged since we've taken over as government, I will fully acknowledge that is a failure in advocacy. In terms of successes in advocacy, though, so I think we ought to recognize first that we're not having a conversation about decriminalization, but we're moving forward legalization and regulation. That conversation moved very quickly, and I think is an important success. I think too, and I've spoken in the House about the Cannabis Act, and I said that when you have someone like myself, a civil libertarian, support the bill, and you have a former police chief like Bill Blair support the bill, that the bill has struck a balance. And I think one important part of that balance is home grow limits. And so allowing households to grow 4 plants, I think is, while so much of the legislation is about control, so much of the legislation is about restricting access, I think yes, we need to take a public health approach, but we also should treat Canadians like the responsible adults they are. And I think the 4-plant limit is a testament to that and strikes that balance between a public health approach and Canadians as responsible adults. So the current state of affairs. So I'm sure many people are familiar with this, but I'll give a sort of a Cole's notes. So the federal government going forward is going to continue to be responsible for regulation of production, licensing, licensed producers. Obviously, the federal government continues to be responsible for the medical access regime, and we can have a conversation about that. I think that's actually an area where there are great future advocacy efforts that should occur. And then much of what our work has been is to set, there was a large report from Anne McClellan and Mark Ware and an expert task force, and the legislation is largely modeled upon that report. And we see, I mentioned the home grow limits. There are, it's about an ounce, otherwise one is able to carry. There are rules relating to age, so there's a minimum age of 18, and provinces are free to set it above that. I should note also provinces can play with the home grow limit, so we'll see what some more conservative jurisdictions like Saskatchewan do. Remains to be seen. I think that you're also going to see municipal governments have to deal with home grow and just neighbor disputes and nuisance issues. We've seen the same issues arise in Oregon, certainly, and so I think we should learn lessons from other jurisdictions on this front. So the federal government has also brought forward parallel legislation with respect to driving, and we can have a conversation about the fairness of that, particularly as it relates to medical users. Basically, there will be a summary offense for 2 to 5 nanograms and an indictable offense for over 5 nanograms in one system, and that's partner legislation to the Cannabis Act. And as it relates to distribution, the federal government basically said the provinces are going to be responsible for distribution. So other than a minimum age limit, and other than basically a nod to say if provinces don't allow for distribution, the federal government will have a backstop through the mail, which I think is, I've had brief conversations with folks from Manitoba who are asking about this. And certainly we don't want to see provinces just reimpose prohibition, so there ought to be a distribution backstop in a worst case scenario. But most provinces, I think, are going to be embracing some model of distribution. And we can talk about the Ontario model that has just been announced. I'm not at the provincial side, so I don't know too much about the the behind-the-scenes conversations that happened. But at the federal level, we are committed to, and rightfully so, when you look at alcohol, different provinces have different regulatory models for distribution of alcohol. So too with cannabis. It's not the federal government's role to dictate one solution for all provinces. And so Ontario moving forward with an LCBO style model. Now, by way of background, I do know, just based on a drug policy town hall that we had where we had a representative from CAMH attend, certainly CAMH in 2014, they published a cannabis policy paper, and that paper proposed legalization, supported legalization, but had 10 principles. And the first of those principles was that it ought to be government run from a public health point of view, and the distributor, the government monopoly distributor, ought to have a public health focus as opposed to just a pure profit focus. And so from a public health perspective, from CAMH's perspective, they would certainly support the actions taken by the Ontario government. Obviously, from a consumer perspective, there will be a differing point of view. But fact is, from a consumer perspective, it's not ideal, perhaps. I was just in Kelowna and for the National Liberal Caucus meeting, and you're walking down the main street, and there's the Okanagan Craft Distillery, and you can go in, you can buy gin, and get it shipped to your home address in Ontario. It's great from a consumer perspective. From a public health perspective, it's less clear that that's such a good thing. And so, from a public health perspective, as government actors, we have to consider all outcomes and not just what's best for consumers. And so the federal government has done one thing on the public health front that I should have mentioned, which is restricting commercial advertising. So you're going to see it's going to be treated more like tobacco with respect to advertising than alcohol. You're not going to get a glossy flyer in the mail from the CCBO in the same way you do from the LCBO. And from a distribution model from the provincial perspective, they've adopted this CCBO type model for public health reasons, which open to debate, but that's why. And I do think there are good public policy and public health reasons for going down that road. And just to put it all in context, I know people are going to be frustrated with that proposal to varying degrees, but it's 2017 and people are still getting arrested for simple possession of marijuana, and next year you are going to be able to have mail order cannabis to your door. So, I mean, keep it in perspective. We can all have our own opinions on the right distribution model, but I think there's no question when you look around the world, and yes, Colorado, yes, Washington, yes, Oregon, but when you look around the world, we are way ahead of other jurisdictions, and this is progress. So, a bit about future advocacy efforts. So, one, record suspensions. So this is a conversation we had a little bit with Corrections Canada and at a committee I used to sit on, the National Security Committee. But an expedited record suspension process is incredibly important, recognizing that this current legislative scheme, prohibition, is unjust. We have to correct the injustices, and legalization is absolutely a move forward, but we have to correct the past injustices of prohibition, and so I think it's very important, at the very least for simple possession. I would argue low-level trafficking, the nonviolent trafficking, would make a good deal of sense as well, but I doubt my government will go there. I think more plausibly, we should focus efforts on simple possession charges and records, and where people are, at the very least, their employment's affected, their travel to the United States is affected. We should undo these injustices as much as possible and as quickly as possible. Impair charges. So, I was speaking at a cannabis business conference, and people were talking about, different potential profits under a legalization regime, and I joked that the real beneficiaries of the proposed legislation will be criminal lawyers, and I think there are real concerns, especially as it relates to patients and the impact that the proposed driving offenses will have upon their ability to use a vehicle, and the science is not there, I don't think, to fully justify the 2 to 5 nanogram, at the very least, limits as they relate to summary offenses, and I think we're going to see the courts deal with this if we pass the legislation as is. Edibles and oils. So, again, this is incremental. So again, everyone might have an idea of the picture-perfect world of legalization. I can tell you from a government point of view, I might be there to say, let's stop the arrests, let's push for home grow limits, let's move forward as quickly as we can. But there are a lot of people in government and a lot of people in the general population who are not who have not used cannabis, who are unfamiliar with cannabis, who think it's much more dangerous than it actually is and are worried about it. And so I think for that reason, you're going to see a much more incremental approach. And so to that point, we see and the same thing happened in Uruguay, by the way. So Uruguay said we're going to move forward with legalization, but we're going to park the issue of edibles and oils to a later day. And that's exactly what the federal regime has done as well. It's unfortunate because when you look at one of the key goals of taking this out of the illicit market and bringing it all above board, if you do that only with if you only do that with the plant and you don't do that with edibles and oils, there's going to continue to be a gray and underground market as it relates to edibles and oils, which I think is counter to the very purpose that we're pursuing. But again, cautious incrementalism wins the day on this, and so more advocacy is needed to establish a framework for those products. And the last key piece of advocacy I think that has to happen is integrating the existing culture, existing employees within that culture, existing knowledge from growers and beyond into a legal framework is incredibly important. So whether the push at the CCBO is hiring people who have expertise, who are from the cannabis community, that should be an advocacy piece, whether it's making sure that criminal charges or criminal records, old criminal records, don't impede someone from participating in the new industry, I think has to be part of the conversation and advocacy efforts. And so record suspensions and paracharges, edibles and oils, and integrating the existing culture and expertise in the new system, I think are all outlets for advocacy going forward, where no hard and fast decisions have necessarily been made from provincial and or federal government points of view. The last piece is patient advocacy, and I think when we talk about rec, so much of the push for recreational marijuana has informally happened through this expansion of patient access through the courts. But now that governments are moving forward with legalization, I think we need to reconsider the patient access model and make sure we are really providing access as much as possible in the easiest way for patients. And so a few things on this. You know, I've spoken with folks who rely upon their medical cannabis and yet pay for it out of pocket, and their insurance companies won't cover it because it doesn't have a drug identification number. That's something that the federal government needs to fix, no question. I've met with folks from Arthritis Canada who want tens of millions, I forget, it was over $10 million of research put into cannabis, funding for research put into cannabis research. And it's interesting, they're not an advocacy group you would normally consider a cannabis advocacy group, but they see great potential for folks who are suffering from arthritis in cannabis. And so advocating from a patient perspective for research funding is incredibly important. I think grow limits. It's unclear to me if we have a 4 plant per household grow limit for on the recreational side, what does that mean for a medicinal user when 4 plants is not going to meet that patient's needs? And are we really going to force the patient to forego something that is free for them, free medication, rather than force them to pay for something that they could otherwise obtain free? That, from an equity perspective, that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I mentioned driving already, and then the dispensary model. So when we have in Ontario, and we'll see what other provinces pursue, but if we have government-run, effectively government-run dispensaries from a recreational point of view, where does that leave patients and access for patients? And so when Justice Phelan says that dispensaries are at the heart of access for patients, I think we have to take that seriously. And whether it's through pharmacies, which would be a plausible and I think a good solution for patient access, or otherwise, I think we have to solve that problem, and we have to solve it as political actors and not be forced to do so by the courts. With that, I mean, those are my general views on the current state of affairs. I will say no legislation comes out perfectly, having had 2 years in Ottawa. I have a little bit of a record for disagreeing on occasion with the government, my own government and my own party for various decisions. I think I've set some record for, at one point I was 13% of the time disagreeing, although I think it's probably less than that now. But on this, and we can have debates around the edges, but if you asked me 5 years ago whether I was going to see legalization in my lifetime, I would have been very skeptical. And so to be sitting here and talking about details and debating the details of legalization and disagreeing over details, I'm very happy to be disagreeing over details, and that we're not going to be arresting people, and we're going to be moving beyond prohibition as of 2018. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions and have a bit of a conversation. We got a bit of a small crowd here to have a conversation, so fire away.
You can come up here.
Hi, I'm David Shirelli, medical cannabis patient and writer as well too on Cannabis News and Views for Toronto and Canada. Thank you very much, first of all, for coming out here on Sunday morning. I wish there were more people could hear this. It's really good that you could come out. We appreciate your efforts. I'm going to be a little critical here, and please don't take this personally, but just I think it's time, and I wish we did have more critical discussion, actually. One is, as a medical cannabis patient, when I use the licensed producers, they can't supply. That's the bottom line, and it's chronic. And we keep hearing this again and again and again in the news. Well, they'll, like, especially with the, I love the way you said it, the CCBO and all that. It's not going to happen, folks. I mean, we are the underground. We're going to be token, and this thing's going to fall off the rails. I wish that could be addressed more and put forward that, God bless them, but the licensed producers cannot produce now, and I don't see this being changed in the year ahead, where right now we have all these people here who are providing excellent stuff that got to be incorporated and I think pardoned and made a part of the process. I hope you can look into that and present that more strongly in Ottawa as well, too.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
a couple things on that. I don't view the, as I mentioned sort of in my, at the end there, I don't view the proposed CCBO or what other provinces are moving forward with. I view that as the recreational solution, not a solution
Yes.
for patient access at all.
Yes.
And so when we, this is the interesting piece of our federation. So you have effectively overlapping jurisdiction in some ways here, where the federal government has said we're going to license producers, provinces you do distribution, but with the exception being the federal government is still responsible for distributing the medical regime. And so we're not passing the buck to the provinces on that front. And so there are a couple problems.
But to use that model is not working for us, so I don't see how you're going to make it bigger and for
the current LP
recreational.
model. Yeah, so there are a few problems with, as I understand, and I'd be open to hearing additional problems. I understand one problem as an example to be that as a patient you are tied to an LP. And so obviously if you can't easily shop around for a product that suits you, you're not going to have the access that you necessarily need. So that makes good sense. We ought to be empowering patients here. I think as the conversation evolves so that people are comfortable on the rec side and the debate over the CCBO on the rec side, that's fine. But we shouldn't forget the patient's needs. And I think that's why I close with that is because I think it's one of the most important pieces of advocacy going forward to ensure that, as an example, one solution may be that with a prescription, you ought to be able to go into any pharmacy and fill your prescription. That would, I think, meet patient access needs, and we ought to do that as a federal government.
The other issue I wanted addressed was, and I hope this can be brought up as soon as possible, it's just not right that we're paying taxes on our prescriptions through the licensed producers. I mean, what medical patient has to pay taxes on their prescriptions? It's just, I don't know why that's still on the books, and I hope that could be addressed. It's it's just wrong.
So I've recently raised with the health ministry the issue of the drug identification number. I'm happy to raise that as well. I've spoken a number of times with Jonathan Zaid, who's been a great patient advocate as well, and I'd be happy to raise those concerns.
Thank you very much, Erskine.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Daniel from Dope Chef Media, and I was wondering if Bill Blair himself has asked for your opinion on these issues, or if you were asked at all to be part of the task force, or how.
I was not asked to be part of the task force, but I can tell you Bill Blair has heard my opinions more times than Bill Blair wants to hear my opinions. Bill Blair sits in front of me in the House of Commons, and I repeatedly am bugging Bill Blair. I'll give you an example, just as a small. This is more of a joke example. I've sat beside Bill in caucus. He sits in front of me in the House. We've sat and discussed this for hours in the House lobby. I have made my views very clear. I had a personal conversation with Minister Philpott to say, if you don't have home grow in this legislation, it's going to be, you're not going to be striking the right balance for, and it's going to be far too restrictive. So I was very happy to see that balance was struck. So not through the task force per se was I involved, but I've certainly made my views known. And Bill sits close enough that I'd written an article in Vice in January to say cannabis legalization is excellent and safe injection clinics are excellent, but if you follow the logic of harm reduction to its logical conclusion, we ought to actually decriminalize all drugs in the same way that Portugal did. And the leader of the opposition got up and said, "The member from Beaches, East York wants to legalize all drugs." And there I am nodding my head, and I felt like I was, and asked a question of the Prime Minister. So it felt like I was asking a question of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister gets up and, fully recognize we are not in a position where the Prime Minister is ready to commit to decriminalizing all drugs. That's why I thought it important to write the article and start the conversation and push for this. I hope it happens. I do hope we see this in a shorter time period than many think. In the same way, we're seeing legalization happen quite quickly after it became a serious point of conversation. Anyway, all this is to say, the Prime Minister got asked a few times about this, and at one point he got up and said, we're not looking to decriminalize any other drug at this time. And Bill's close enough that I got to slap him on the shoulder and he goes, Bill, he said, at this time. So Bill has definitely heard from me on many occasions.
Good morning. My name's Janine Mora, and I'd just like you to know I am a medical cannabis patient, but I have been a medical cannabis advocate, lover, and user for 40 years. 40 years. It has helped me so much. It's made me really, if I'd listened to the doctors, I'd be, you know, one of those addicts on the streets, really, on Oxy or something like that. So, I mean, it's very funny, the other question, because my question basically was, it seems like a lot of these problems we have with the legislation going forward seems to be because Bill Blair's at the head. So basically my question is, how do we get rid of Bill Blair? And how do we get somebody who is actually knowledgeable? Because Bill Blair comes from a perspective where people who smoke cannabis are thugs and criminals. This is all this man knows. He does not know how cannabis helps a grandmother. He doesn't know how it helps somebody with a brain tumor. He doesn't know how it enables people to be able to get on the subway because, you know, the subway's a scary place for them because something happened to them down there, because they can actually go to work in the morning and work and make money to pay taxes because they're able to smoke cannabis.
So can I say, I'll say two things. First, on a more personal note, I've got Crohn's, and so I can appreciate the patient perspective in particular, which is why I'm incredibly sympathetic to that advocacy and why I highlighted it at the end. With respect to Bill Blair, though, so first off, Bill, I don't think, I would say I didn't come here to think I was going to defend my neighbor in Scarborough Southwest, but frankly, so I'd say two things in particular. First, Bill has, you may think he sees people who use cannabis as thugs. I think, in fact, Bill, being on the front lines, saw that cops were wasting their time, and he doesn't want cops to be wasting their time. And I've had the same conversation with retired police chiefs through Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, who would say we are wasting resources policing this. It's an impossible thing to police, and it's too many Canadians. You know, when 40-some-odd% of Canadians have used cannabis in their lifetime, good luck treating them all like criminals. So I think, to be fair to Bill sees prohibition with respect to cannabis as a failed policy and certainly believes in legalization and regulation. The second thing I would say is you're accusing Bill of things that I think most Canadians are, and you could accuse most Canadians of the same thing, which is why I think when you pragmatically look at convincing Canadians that legalization and regulation is the important way forward, yeah, you could have me. I'm 33 years old. I am more vocal about freedom and cannabis activism in politics than most of my colleagues, I would say. Am I the right person to convince the Canadians who are incredibly worried and think it's a dangerous drug? And probably not. And so if Bill and I can agree that the policy strikes a balance, that we're both happy enough with legalization and regulation framework, I think that's a good thing, and I think it will bring most, if not all, Canadians on board. So I think Bill should be credited with legalization to a large degree.
I'm really sad as I'm getting older that all my hard-earned tax dollars are being wasted on something like this when there's so many people in this country that need the money more than the police do for criminalizing people who smoke cannabis. the money that they have now should be enough to deal with, other people who really are criminals on the street. We live in a big city where there have been, lots of things have happened in this city, and the police should be looking for criminals, real criminals, people who've actually hurt people, and not people who are, enjoying cannabis.
But I
We're
think that-
not the people who make cannabis in this city. We don't carry guns. We're not criminals. We're good people who pay taxes. I don't understand it at all. We're not running around schoolyards giving cannabis to school children. We're not like that. We're helping each other enjoy cannabis to adults who need it and would like it. And we would love for everybody in this country to be able to enjoy cannabis, get the health benefits. We're spending enormous amounts of money on health care. Seniors are being doped out of their minds by drugs that doctors give them. You can't even get anywhere near as high from cannabis as you can from an opiate. An opiate can get you insanely high, hundreds of times more high than cannabis can. But a doctor can give that to you. And not every doctor is willing to give cannabis. It's just very, very crazy.
So I got it. So I thanks for the comments. The only thing I gotta say, I have to emphasize this point about context, because am I happy that there are continued arrests in the interim? No, I think we should have interim regulations in the same way that Oregon had. But the idea that the sky is falling when we're so much closer to a just policy than we were, I think is just the complete and total wrong perspective. I mean, we've had in the last the last numbers, it was like over 50,000 Canadians were charged with simple possession of cannabis. That is outrageous that happened in 2015. So for me to sit here and decry the policy and say this is such a terrible thing. No, I think we're light years ahead of where we have been. So is it perfect? No. Are there advocacy efforts that should continue to happen? Absolutely. But this ranting against the policy, I think, is absolutely counterproductive and the wrong approach, and we should be embracing the change that's happened. It's a good thing.
Oh, okay. Hi. First, do you consume cannabis at all? Are you a consumer?
It's I certainly.
'Cause, you understand how important that question is when you're trying to deal with policy that directly deals with people that consume it as on a medical level.
Yeah. So I can't. So I don't have a card. I mentioned Crohn's. So when I was an undergrad, I certainly use it rather than seeking out like the steroids or medication. I certainly found that it would help with all sorts of things in terms of stop me feeling nauseous. It would encourage.
So you do understand that there are medical benefits.
Yeah,
and whatnot.
completely. Yeah,
Okay.
and I've read the case law, and I've read the Parker decision. I've read the Aller decision. I've followed the case law all the way through.
Awesome.
I've studied the issue through Melmo Levine and otherwise. I'm very familiar with the. My argument to the health ministry on drug identification numbers, as an example, they come back and they say, well, it's only for drugs that are that have been tested in this way, and I think it's Sativex or something. There's like one cannabis product, and I said, well, fine, but that doesn't make a ton of sense to me, because when you have courts that say there's enough scientific evidence that we're providing access to patients, how are we then telling them that we're not going to pay for that medication if there's enough science that a court is relying upon it? So I'm very sympathetic to that view, but
Yeah, sorry. My point was that if you know the medical benefits and you know and you have consumed at least, like that's
Sure.
great. That like I appreciate that. Like now that validates your view almost. You know what I mean? Okay, he consumed at least. You hopefully would understand how ludicrous the comparison of alcohol is to cannabis. They're completely different things. Like they're not the same, and to be treated the same, it's funny. Like cannabis somewhere sits between coffee and wine, vitamin C. Like it's a completely different thing, and you're taking on this way of alcohol, which is as an indigenous person, I know how destructive and terrifying this poison is, and you're treating this medicine that we all know is medicine, and personally, I don't believe in recreational use. If you're using it after you put your kids to bed and to calm the fuck down, that's medicinal. If you're using it to fucking get on the train because you're having a hard time, that's medicinal. Like there's no like whatever you need it for. If you need it to watch a movie because it helps you watch a movie better, that's medicinal. Like you take other drugs. You take Adderall to focus on something. You take like you know what I mean? There's all kind. It's always medicinal. I'll argue that forever.
So I would say in some cases it can be performance enhancing and not medicinal. So as an example, if you are wanting to relax to win the gold medal in snowboarding, probably you're not calling that medicinal. You're calling it performance enhancing. So I think we have to be more careful about using the word medicinal for people who are actually requiring the patient access, and there's the science to bear it out. I'll give you, and I do think
I am a patient also. Me and my wife both.
And I think we also ought to. So I'll say first thing, it's not even close to as harmful as alcohol. Okay, the science is obvious, but the most recent literature review from the National Academy of Sciences in January of this year does identify real harms, okay? Real potential harms, I should say. So if you are a pregnant woman, you should not be smoking cannabis. You should not be consuming cannabis. The evidence is that there's a greater likelihood with underweight births, okay? That's the evidence. There's also evidence, and this is the Center of Addiction and Mental Health's point of why they take the public health approach. There are concerns. There's an association, so a potential harm related to repeated use, not just occasional use,
but this
from
is
those
like,
who are younger with mental health
hold
issues.
On, like
and with alcohol too.
Here's a situation though. Here's a specific situation where, say, pregnant mother who had cancer and is using cannabis for pain control. For pain control, and instead of like, you know what I mean, like the research that said, like, should she take the fentanyl that she was prescribed, or should she use cannabis?
But hang on, you got to divide the conversation into recreational and how we treat recreational, and what are the benefits and what are the costs, okay? And from a
but we're talking about medicine and helping people, and it comes down to like dimes and cents, which is pretty frustrating. And also like when we're talking about decriminalization, which I'm behind, bro, that's massive, and you need to keep pushing that because it's not about like people getting high. It's about saving fucking lives. People are dying. I have friends that are like, they lost like 70 friends this year. Like, can you imagine losing 70 friends? I don't even know if I have 70 friends, bro.
You're preaching to the choir on that issue. My only point would be, when it comes to medicinal access, yes, of course, we should be liberalizing access for patients, no question, and we should be having a patient-centered point of view. There's zero question about that, and there's enough science that courts have relied upon to expand patient access, and repeated governments, both liberal and conservative, have been pulled kicking and screaming by courts to do the right thing, and governments going forward should be leading the charge. Fine. But from a recreational point of view, I do think it's very reasonable for a government to take a public health point of view to say there are potential harms associated with the substance, particularly for minors, as identified by literature.
Too. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to be... to me, it's the same as coffee. I smoke weed with my coffee. Like,
So, look,
do you know what I mean? So, like,
I think it's fair to say
you're trying to tell us that, like, it's as ridiculous to me, like, trying to regulate cannabis as it is to try to regulate coffee.
And it may be to you.
And again, this performance enhancing, this like whatever you need to get on to get to work, it's the same sort of thing. It fits in the same category as far as I'm concerned.
So, okay, so we will differ to some degree here, because when it comes to recreational use, I don't think it's there's no there's not the same when it comes to patient access. We want to expand it for reasons of fairness and for reasons of providing as many benefits as we can to people who are suffering. Okay, when it comes to individuals more generally, yes, there are benefits to cannabis use, whether it be social benefits, whether it be benefits to if I want to read philosophy and think about philosophy in a different way, there are probably benefits.
Absolutely.
But that's not the same. Those aren't the same important benefits that a patient derives from the substance, and there are potential harms. So from a government's point of view, taking a public health approach, okay, yeah, should we treat it the same as alcohol? Probably not. Alcohol is way more dangerous. But you know what? Operating heavy machinery and driving under the influence of cannabis, different people will be affected in different ways.
Sure.
But intoxication is intoxication, and people will drive worse if they are intoxicated using
people
cannabis.
who are stoned don't drive. Like people who are too stoned are like, yo, I'm too fucking
Except
stoned.
that the
and
evidence
don't
doesn't
drive.
the evidence doesn't bear that out. So yes, people do get into accidents because they've smoked cannabis. I would also say we when you're convincing the general public to come on board. Yes, we should have a science-based, responsible conversation about the real potential harms. But okay, so let's have that. I just
See,
did.
that's not a way to get people on board, though. Like, look how scary this is. Let's talk about all the benefits that it brings.
No. It's not about how scary it is. It's about responsible use. To say, look,
Sure.
if someone wants to have a scotch on a Friday night, and someone wants to use their vaporizer on a Friday night, people can pick their own poison, as it were. But we should not be so liberal as to say, but go into work high, drive high. There's no problem with these things. There are obvious problems with these things, and as a government, we should be preaching a public health approach, and we should be saying there are responsible ways to use this potentially, in certain scenarios, dangerous substance, and so here are the responsible ways to use it, and here are the ways not to use it at all. I think that we should be having that conversation. Just to say all uses are medicinal, I think is flippant, and I think it does a disservice to convincing people that this is the right approach.
I'm somewhere in the middle here, so I wanted to jump in and kind of piggyback on this question before we wrap up with a few more. Specifically, because let's say we fully agree with you on the public health. Of course, I agree with you on a public health stance. And you agree that it isn't as bad as alcohol,
yep.
But you mentioned that we won't be getting the glossy CCBO magazine that the LBO gets. So that's my question. Why does the LCBO, if we're recognizing that alcohol is more dangerous, get to sell on the streets? They get their magazines. If you go to a festival, they will be out there. At least give us that then. If you recognize that it's better, at least give us that so we can compete with alcohol, and you'll actually, we promise, on Ian's side, you'll see the great benefits, and you won't see, like if you legalize alcohol tomorrow from no alcohol, you would see all the public health shit you're talking about on a much higher regard than we're talking about marijuana. So when we legalize marijuana, I think it's important to remember that people aren't going to start crashing their cars on the street. We don't need $274 million to police something we should be policing less of. I mean, it's already out there. Yes, I agree with you. Shit happens, and it is important for the government to monitor it. But why does the LCBO... can we just compete with the LCBO?
Yeah, so I will agree that it's completely irrational to treat cannabis more restrictively than alcohol, okay? It's completely irrational. So what's the answer? One answer is to liberalize the rules related to cannabis. The other answer is to be much more restrictive with how we treat alcohol. And so perhaps we should not have those glossy flyers go to people's mailboxes from the LCBO. For a consistent rational policy,
that's not what I'm advocating.
Yeah, but I know. But one of those two approaches is the right answer, right? I mean, I'm all for consistency and rational consistency, treating drugs according to their respective harms. I think we should do that for all drugs, and alcohol is more harmful than cannabis, sure. But I don't think that says let's liberalize cannabis. I think probably from a public health approach, it says let's be much more restrictive on advertising the way we allow distribution of alcohol. But that people are in favor of that.
And I mean, we see the opposite happening with alcohol, but I think we met somewhere in the middle there, right, guys? Okay, and I know we have another question waiting here. Oh, sorry, this gentleman was waiting. Do you mind?
I have a real quick question. And you said you would hope that people here were able to transition to the legal market, which is something I'm really big on. But we have a big problem. and that most people aren't even aware of that. The problem is the pick, the person in charge. It's the RCMP approval that you need to get in to visit a grow. I work at a legal producer and have a babysitter, essentially, who's the person in charge. I would imagine if I stole from my company, like other stealings at corporations, the company would have a pretty big issue with that. How can we, because if you have a criminal record or if you have any engagement in cannabis, you're prohibited from getting that pick status. How can we get that through to the government? Like, hey, to transition, you need to like fix the security, the person in charge security first.
We were talking about this a little bit earlier. I'm not that aware. I don't know the details of the rule and where that rule is embedded in terms of the regulations and the law. So I'd be happy to ask the question of the relevant ministry to say, are we considering changing this? What's the rationale and justification for this being in place? And is this not going to inhibit what we actually want, which is to bring expertise into this legal framework? So I'd be happy to pursue that and get an answer and see if there's room to move the needle a little bit on that. Obviously, if there are so many regulations that are already applied to the LPs, including video surveillance of every square inch of the facility that's to be kept for a very long time. So it sounds like over-regulation, what you're talking about, but again, I don't know too much in terms of details, and happy to pursue it.
Thank you for your patience, my friend.
Hi, my name is Richard, and first of all, thank you for taking the time to come here on a Sunday morning. Just a couple of things in perspective I think we were talking about in terms of making marijuana palpable to the majority of Canadians and such too. I think if we go back, there was that period of prohibition which forbid something. We saw that just didn't work. But then you had a movie like Reefer Madness come out, which totally poisoned the minds of Americans. And I've talked to so many bouncers at various clubs, and they said, you know something? We have virtually no problems, and believe me, I can just take a whiff. I know who the stoners are in the club sitting there, and what do they do when they get high? They keep our kitchen busy. It's the drunks that have to be taken physically and thrown out, and it's the same guys all the time. Yeah. So really, there are far fewer problems with smoking dope than there is getting drunk and abusive. And
I won't disagree with that.
The other thing is, too, you're talking about the promotion of the LCBO and everything. I'm old enough to remember that if you were doing a little card game in the back of a convenience store, you had a little slot machine, you could be sure the police would be there with battle axes to break the doors down and destroy these machines. Suddenly, the government is now making money on lotteries. It's the same thing they're doing in the back, but suddenly now we get all the glossy commercials just like the LCBO that has come out. So it really is just on a perspective basis as to what the government is going to sort of approve. And I think we have to be a little careful. If you enjoy marijuana, you don't want to go into a situation where people are listening and governments where you say, let's kick all the doors open. I want to be able to carry it with me. I want to grow 50 plants. I want to give them free samples to all my friends. You can't come with that kind of approach to the Canadian people and the government and say, welcome a new habit into your arms and be open to it. So I think we do have to be a lot more gentle and be thankful for the progress that we're making. It's a little slow, but so has every other human rights issue that has come before North America. And it is slow. And you've got people, in fact, without getting too political, I think we're seeing a lot of things in the States where people's old 100, 200-year-old ideals of bigotry are coming out. And they're sort of saying, well, it's about statues. No, it's a lot more about their bigotry and such than that. So the old ideas still hang in there, and you have to be very gentle in rocking people's little ideas. So I think your approach is right, if I'm right, about slowly open all the doors, let's get the first things in, then we can do a little bit more along the line. So I think it's really good. My other question is just your opinion here, unrelated to Canada. The States now has, if I'm correct, a prison system that is absolutely for profit. The more people they can throw in jail, the more money these institutions make. And they're not part of the government, they're privately run institutions. Do you feel that that's going to be a real factor in the States in prohibiting more states from opening up and legalizing marijuana because they're going to lose probably, what would you say, 30% of their prison population if they get rid of possession as a crime?
So I appreciate the comments about incrementalism, and certainly as I mentioned, with respect to perspective, I think we are moving forward in the right way. As regards the United States, I don't really know what the answer is, other than private prison systems create horrible, perverse incentives with respect to public policy. They're a bad idea, and they create a demand for more prisoners for profit, and that's just a completely wrong-headed thing for governments to be embracing. So whether it has an impact on cannabis policy per se, I don't know what the answer is to that.
Good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
John Conroy. My concern is, one of the previous speakers also mentioned, I think, is this whole problem of them saying, will you jump the gun, or you have a prior record, therefore we're not going to allow you to participate in the new market. And I'm concerned that that's what's coming down the pike. And yet, and we're going to end up in this strange situation, because in BC, we now have the city taking a wholly different approach to the city of Toronto, where various clubs and dispensaries have essentially fit themselves within the zoning and licensing regs, even though they're not lawful, although some of them who are ensuring that there's medical approval arguably are. In fact, the BC Compassion Club, I think, got rave reviews, not only back in the Senate report, but in this recent task force report. And when you look at the bylaw in Vancouver, it's a $1,000 fee for a compassion club, a true compassion club, versus $30,000 for a dispensary, but I digress. But, the problem with the LPs was you'd have these security clearances, and the guy who was doing them in BC anyway was the same Corporal Holmquist who was the guy who was called somewhat biased in the Allard case by Judge Phelan. And so it's not a matter of just a criminal record. Is there something in a database? Yeah. We saw you in a database, or we've got you in a database sitting in a car with a guy we think is a member of organized crime. They're both on the same soccer team, and there was nothing to indicate maybe that this guy knew that much about the other one, but that was enough after they'd spent quite a pile of money trying to put the whole thing and everything together. And I think the same thing happened to an ex-Prime Minister of England who, in his university days, got up to something. And anyway, they put it all over the news one time, and turned out they couldn't even verify the source. So those are the things that are prejudicing people. And so I don't know what we do to convince, as you said, we want to bring them in. They're the ones who are doing it and have the expertise and all the rest of it. And we haven't had, as far as I know, anybody suffering from pesticide or any of these sorts of things in the last 40 years of other people growing cannabis. And suddenly we've had it with the LPs.
Yeah.
So, the difference between big growing and small growing and paying attention and all that sort of stuff. So I think that's really key, because the bottom line is we have to get rid of the black market. And if we do anything that limits things too much, we're going to be stuck with it. Right?
So I will say two things. First, I don't know if you were here when I opened my comments, but I really want to thank you directly for all your work with NORML. I remember I've certainly read about your work ever since I was studying politics and law, and I think you've pursued law in the right way, and I probably wouldn't be sitting here but for all of your talking about legalization, but for all of your efforts over the years. So I really want to say thank you. And the second thing is, I completely agree with you. The more we limit participation in the legal market, the more we push that participation. People who are expert in growing, people who have been part of this industry and this culture for decades, they're going to continue to participate in the industry and the culture, whether we embrace them or not. So we ought to embrace them. I mean, it would make no sense.
And it's really going to be a provincial issue, and that's why we've got this interesting situation of Ontario announcing this LCBO model the other day. You've got, you know, the city of Toronto with the raids and everything compared to this, what's going on in Vancouver. So if there was simply a way to say, okay, we've got a business, we've got an industry here, let's just allow them to apply for licenses. You know, you got to tell us 10% GST, 5% PST or whatever, and let's get going and bring them in. And, you know, sure, there may be some that are problems and so on, but too many times I see in legislation, if you've got a criminal record within the last 10 years for a designated drug offense, you can't do anything. And I say, well, was that part of the punishment? Did the person serve their sentence? You know, do they have to get a pardon before they can apply? And, you know, is that how they...
I've had conversations with others about the sort of the impact on minority communities as well, in particular, who are more likely to have criminal records as the outcome of involvement in drug activities. Certainly, your privileged upper middle class white kid from Toronto is probably not getting the same treatment or having the same record in a database, and so there are issues on that front as well. I don't know what the perfect answer is. Different problems. So I think it's both federal and provincial. Federal, particularly on the growing side. And so what Matt was talking about is a rule that I've got to get my head around and talk to the government about. As it relates to the distribution framework, whether it's people who are working in dispensaries right now, I don't think anyone who is currently involved in as an employee, as it were, through a dispensary, or they should all be able to, and they ought to, you know, walk down the street and walk into the CCBO and start working there, as far as I'm concerned. That would make good sense to me, and I hope the provinces embrace that. You're not going to see, I also hope we don't see a very, you know, I don't know what the right description, I hope we don't see a very aggressive crackdown of existing dispensaries either. I hope it's they're phased out and transitioned out in a more or transitioned in might be a better way of putting it. But the government of Ontario, I don't think is going to move off the CCBO model, and so then the next question is, how do you take the players or the employees specifically who make a living out of this and bring them into the fold through a CCBO model, and what are the potential possibilities there?
Well, I'm told in Washington State, which is a sort of an LCBO model, that and I was just down there at HempFest a couple of weeks ago, that there's still a thriving black market. Why? Because the cost of putting together a dispensary, the regulations are so cause you to incur so many costs, plus the taxation, have pushed the prices really out of range. And so people have gone back to the black market.
So this is a really important point that we didn't really discuss in detail, but it's incredibly important that provinces in particular, so in the task force report, it was very clear we got to keep this at current market prices, otherwise people are just going to go where it's cheapest. That's just, frankly, if I've got an existing, if I've got an existing supplier and okay, now I can legally obtain something that's more expensive and in a more convoluted way, why would I not keep the current system, as it were, which hasn't been a problem for me over the years? So that I think is a real concern, and so provinces have to bear in mind the federal advice, which is not to tax this to the point that we allow the black market to continue to thrive. As it relates to an overburdened regulatory framework, remains to be seen. So I'm partial to, I think it was a missed opportunity in many ways not to pursue what Vancouver pursued, which was, okay, we don't want them in certain communities that haven't consulted those communities in the same way you might not want a bar or a beer store. Okay, so be it. But there are communities that will embrace these, and I don't think cracking down in an aggressive way across the board made a ton of sense. I certainly didn't think it made sense from an allocation of resources point of view and clogging the criminal courts all over again. But I think whether the CCBO model is the preferred model from a consumer perspective, I do think it has the potential to be a workable model. So I'm not ready yet to say, oh, this isn't going to work, and I see this as a complete and total failure. I see the LCBO model work with alcohol. I don't think we have a thriving underground market in any way with respect to alcohol. And I think the same, to your point about bringing people into the illicit market, I think is incredibly important so that doesn't continue to happen, and we don't have forks going off and illicit activity continue to happen because it's always happened. But I think the CCBO model is workable in theory, and it's just a matter of making sure that the regulations in practice don't undermine it.
They don't have enough detail yet, I don't think, to understand
Exactly,
who's going to be granting the licenses to these stores and
Exactly.
who's going to be running the stores.
Yeah.
So it's gonna
And there's also, from a consumer perspective, the LCBO prides itself on expertise in their subject matter. Why would you want to deny that for this product as well? I mean, I think you want people who are expert in the substance to be working in these stores.
That's going to be interesting because obviously, as you know, huge sections of the Tobacco Act have been put into the Cannabis Act, and
Yeah.
so the advertising promotion thing is a big issue.
Yeah, but I think that's part of the balance between public health approach and treating Canadians like the responsible adults they are. So you won't hear, I think we need to keep pushing at that idea of we are responsible, we deserve basic freedoms, and this is no different from alcohol. In fact, alcohol, as we had a conversation earlier, is more harmful.
Yeah.
But I do think there are real public health considerations as well. And when you look at tobacco as an example, now obviously tobacco and its direct causal effect with cancer is much more harmful in comparison to the literature we have with consuming cannabis. But when you have over the last 50 years ago, 50% of Canadians smoked cigarettes. Now it's less than 15%, and we did it through restricting access in public spaces, and we did it through banning on commercial advertising. So I think that public health approach, and we can have a debate about whether that's appropriate and the harmfulness of cannabis, but taking that public health approach from government does make, I think, strikes a better balance and is fair.
I'm with you. I mean, I think people have to understand that when you legalize something, you are regulating it. You are going to have all kinds of rules that you never had apply to you before.
Exactly.
And you've got to get used to it.
Yeah, and I think the other rule that we need to figure out so that we don't lose it is with respect to home grow. We really need to figure out and learn from, I've read quite a bit about Oregon's experience and nuisance cases and smell cases, and we really have to make sure that there are, whether it's draft legislation that municipalities can easily adopt or whatever the case might be, we really have to make sure that we don't have proliferation of nuisance cases that causes the Canadian public to say this is a bad idea.
No, I think, you know, the big obligation for all of us is to continue to demonstrate how well-behaved cannabis smokers are.
Exactly.
People
Exactly.
should not get busted for impaired driving. Please.
Exactly.
Don't blow yourselves up with trying to make things. You know, we want but most importantly, don't stink out your neighborhood.
Exactly.
So that you get everybody on
I think that's a critical point. You know, if we're going to make the argument that we ought to treat Canadians like responsible adults, then we have to. It's incumbent upon us to act like responsible adults. Yeah, no question.
One last little thing. You mentioned the National Academy of Science Engineering report. Remember, it's a study of what studies existed.
Yeah, exactly.
And so quite
it's a lit
accurately
review, yeah.
said there's lots of stuff we haven't been able to figure out because we haven't been able to study it. But I think the most important thing in that report was it did say that of the studies that exist, there is conclusive evidence that it's effective for chronic pain.
Exactly.
And that chronic pain is what people, for some, not everybody dying from fentanyl is out there from chronic pain, but the doctors who've prescribed oxys and perks and so on, and people who've got addicted, they've gone to the street. We now have double-blind, placebo-based studies to show that cannabis is one of the most effective exit strategy drugs.
So
somehow we have to get that
agree.
in there.
Yeah, I agree with
stop
that.
the deaths.
I completely agree with that. And the only other thing I would say on that study, and this is, I had a debate with a younger conservative colleague of mine that'll air on TVO at some point in November, and he kept talking about the significant harms, and pulling this study. And it's very important not to discount the potential harms, but to talk about them as potential harms, not necessary harms that are certainly going to happen for anyone who uses, and to talk about how the literature says there's an association. We don't know enough. There's enough from a government public health perspective to be cautious, to take an incremental approach, and to be a little bit worried about it, but it's not enough to definitively say this is such a very harmful substance. There are potential harms, and to your point, yeah, there are proven benefits and only potential harms.
Thank you very much for everything that you've been doing in there.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
I'm a little concerned because our neighbor to the south is under new management and no idea what they're really about. So what is the problem with getting a legal medical marijuana license here? chances of that information showing up at the Border Patrol some point when we decide to go to the States and they go, excuse me, we don't even know if you have any, but you have a medical marijuana license. You're not the kind of person that we've decided we want to let into the States.
Well,
So how protected is that personal information if we get one here? That's my real concern about not getting it.
well, it's supposed to be private, and so, but you know, a lot of people tell me they don't keep their card or their paperwork with them when they go to the States. But I think it's changed considerably because of Washington State being,
Exactly.
if you're in BC, Washington State's legal. There's still federal people on the border, but I've been told, you know, people who've run dispensaries and so on, while they've been pulled in and talked to for a few hours, they've still ultimately been allowed to go in. So it's changed compared to some of the old days when, you know, simple possession or just knowing that you had associated with somebody was enough to stop you from going in.
And
So
from
I
the
don't know
federal
what-
perspective, I would just say that if someone were to be stopped at the border simply by virtue of being a medical cannabis patient and not carrying cannabis on them, that would be something that would be raised with American officials by our Canadian officials. There's no question about that. That would be a cause for concern.
The privacy thing, though, is extremely important, and it's actually the very important issue in terms of what's happening with the opiate crisis. I was counsel for Van Du in the supervised injection site file, and we learned that our biggest problem at the supervised site is to get people in the door. Why? They're ashamed of being addicted. They're not that stereotypical addict that you see in the cartoons or whatever. They're ordinary folks who've had car accidents, who've got oxys, who've become addicted, and bingo, suddenly they're in this situation. They need to be able to go to their doctors and privately discuss their addiction with their doctors and get their doctors to treat them for their addiction, because for many, going to a public place is a problem. So the privacy angle in terms of when you're dealing with it in terms of a health issue is really...
And when we talk about incremental approach, the other thing to consider with safe injection clinics that I've raised, but it's unclear whether we'll get there, is if someone is accessing the black market to obtain the substance and then they can go to use it, okay, there are probably too many steps for a lot of people, and they're going to end up using the substance outside of that safe injection clinic. And so I think a very important next incremental step would be allowing these consumption sites to provide clean supply.
Or as my thing is what used to happen in Britain years ago. When you go to the doctor can prescribe you the very thing you're addicted to in conjunction with the treatment.
Which we have done, but only for severe heroin addictions. There is now a possibility of a prescription. So there are, again, good incremental steps, but it goes slow.
The doctors have always had the power to prescribe heroin. The person had to be an inpatient or an outpatient of the hospital. But I think, as you say, things are...
Yeah, Harper reversed it, and then Philpott just put it back in, yeah.
We also have to get it back for vets and people's pets.
All that time reversing the Harper stuff. I just wanted to check in with you on time.
I should probably get going in a few minutes. So I'm happy to take whatever questions we got.
Can we do two more?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
yeah, of
this
course.
young lady's been waiting for a while, and then we'll have Tracy Curley.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Kobe, and I was part of the organizing team at Broadview Canada Clinic, organizing the union, and we were recognized by the Labor Board, and then, the government said, no, not going to happen. So my question to you is, what is your opinion or stance on, now the public sector union being allowed to take on the workers of cannabis industry, and what's your view on that?
So I mean, I'm in a way it touches on the previous conversation about bringing people in, right? Because it's
well, my question is because then right after the union was cut off, then the raids started happening, right? And people were being charged, and so I guess it also goes into people having charges and then not being allowed into the sector. And I feel like
yeah.
unions.
So yeah, I mean, I can tell. I don't know what I don't know what the government's view of this is in terms of the openness for change and all this. I can tell you my own personal view is that I didn't think people should be arrested in the first place through these raids. Certainly, no employee should be. We had a dispensary next door to my constituency office. And I had conversations with the cops who were saying, yeah, this is a waste of our time, and then we've got to charge these kids a lot of the time, right?
Absolutely.
I think it was a 19-year-old or something and they thankfully didn't walk her out in cuffs, but still, she's now in the system.
It's not even just about walking out in handcuffs. It's about having those charges.
Exactly.
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 Charges of trafficking, a Schedule 1 substance, and that's not a simple charge to just have swept under the rug and not worry about. Especially at 19 years old, you want to go to university.
Yeah,
I
don't think
any
of these.
You want to further your life. And that's a big, big charge. But I'm not just talking about charges and that. So I'm just wondering about, the union public sector taking over, with the CBO model.
So
what your view with like why the private sector wouldn't be allowed to unionize, I guess, is my question of what.
So I don't know too much about
the.
I don't know the details of the case before the labor board.
Okay.
If you guys were seeking to unionize,
we were ratified by the labor board.
Yes,
the labor board said it was fine, but then the union was made to choose between their workers, their 4,400 workers, and their canna clinic workers by the government. They didn't have a choice; they were meant to fold. So it's
right. So I'm not. I don't want to comment, not knowing the details of that. But to the extent that it poses challenges with respect to embracing those in the current community and current culture into the CCBO or whatever the system that is being embraced is, those challenges should be addressed head on.
Yeah.
But in terms of having a union, a public sector union. I have someone who works in my office right now. He worked at the LCBO previously. I don't think it was particularly. He faced too many hurdles in terms of starting to work at the LCBO and joining that union. So if criminal records pose a problem, then those need to be undone. Otherwise, we're going to face the problem of separating people from this.
To exist further, then they would have been able to further help anybody who was charged. Do you see what I'm saying here? So it's not necessarily just about the charges or just about the union, but if the union was allowed to exist, keep going with their canna clinic workers, that the labor board did recognize as a union, they gave their lead union organizer his job back after he was fired for unionizing. That goes to show that they're legal workers and they deserve to have that protection. If the law says that they deserve to have that protection as workers, then, as workers, they deserve that right? It's just, from a worker standpoint, and, it's not just the charges or just the union. Like I said, it's one and the same, the protection.
Again, honestly, I just don't know too much about the mechanics
I'm
of
not
that.
talking specifically.
But I will. My view. One I think positive of the CCBO model is that people are going to be paid fair wages, and that it is going to be a workforce that isn't going to be taken advantage of in any way, and will have recourse. But again, there are obvious concerns of people not in the current system who may be excluded from participating, and I think that's a real cause for concern.
Just want to thank you again for coming in the meantime. Thanks, everybody. This is on POT TV if you missed the beginning of the talk. Nathaniel's been really great with us, so thanks again. Give him a round of applause. And our final question.
Hi there. So I kind of caught the question regarding the border and traveling as a medical marijuana patient. So my situation is a couple of years ago, I decided to go to Seattle from Vancouver. I'm a medical marijuana patient, so I was very aware that that might be an issue. I made sure to study for the exam before I got to the border, and after hours of questioning, I was finally allowed to cross the border. But the people that I was with, when they were asked a question at the border, have you ever in your life consumed marijuana? One guy said, yeah, in college. The other guy said, yes, in 2012, and we were turned away from the border. So the fact that, I don't think we're protected at the border. I mean, once they found out I was a medical marijuana patient, they asked every question to try to trip me up and deny me access. But I was aware of what my legal rights were, and that I wasn't traveling with anything into the U.S. I had a cannabis substitution as a prescription. And people, now that those people, because they even admitted to smoking marijuana at all in Canada, are now being denied at the border in the U.S.
So first, it is crazy that people are turned away who acknowledge smoking cannabis throughout their lifetime, because this is self-reported. It's like 43% of Canadians self-report smoking cannabis in their lifetimes, and that's self-reported, so the number is probably higher. And so should half of Canadians not be able to enter the United States? That is madness. So that should be rectified, and every instance where that does happen should be tracked, and we should be raising these concerns with American officials.
So who should we contact? Because this has been happening to a number of activists and patients that I'm aware of.
You should contact you should contact your MP. There's also the MP will have a line to Global Affairs, where Global Affairs has border support services that should know about this as well, especially as we move forward with legalization. Right? I mean, it makes no sense what you're going to be able to...
especially considering we were going from Vancouver to Seattle.
That makes no sense. The other thing I'll say, just on a personal note, is so at the outset, you mentioned this arcane title that I have of Vice Chair of the Privacy, Access, Information, and Ethics Committee. Well, actually, one important piece of work that we're currently doing, and I'll be in the United States, I hope I don't get asked that question, but I'm going to be going to the United States in early October, and we are studying the protection of Canadians' privacy at the border and in the United States. And so I'd be happy to raise this issue directly with the American officials that we speak to and see to what extent this is ad hoc, that certain officials at the border are enforcing this and others aren't, or to what extent this is actually a prescribed policy.
Okay, thank you.
I knew that would be productive. It always is with Tracy. To piggyback on that a little bit, I want to say I've heard tons of stories like that still happening to this day. And also, the government might want to be with the Grow Your Own, or even as a medical patient with a ACMPR, and I grow my own now, there's trouble even flying within Canada because it's not in that prescriptive LP packaging that the guards are normal to seeing. So it's just a couple doobies rolled up, but you still have your ACM. There's issues even within Canada, and then in the States.
So this goes to my point about patient advocacy, right? So why I don't think we should forget, and in fact, it becomes all the more important once the recreational market's in place. There are all of these little pieces that restrict access in some way, whether it's the drug identification number issue or the issue you've raised. And so the more we get into the nuts and bolts of where access is being impeded or what are the frustrations and hurdles that patients face, we should be undoing all of these hurdles. Patients should not face hurdles for medication. So anyway.
Thank you so much. That's really empowering coming from our MP, and we have some great patient advocates coming up throughout the day, so we can talk to them more about that. We want to thank you again so much for, of course, hope you come back here to Vapor Central, and thank you guys all for the great questions. That was so engaging. Thank you so much.
And thanks again to NORML. I really appreciate all the work that they do.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks, NORML. Thank you, guys. And Vapor Central for having us. There's water and pop and stuff if you guys need. Bathrooms are in the back. Yeah, thanks. We'll be back really soon. Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you again. That was great. You really put you through the ringer. Your hand
If you have some Canadian public being the Canadian public,
thank you so much.
They do these right to do so on the medicinal side. Once it's legal, they won't know. I mean, they won't care. But they're worried about this home grow. And I had the PS come up to the Parliamentary Secretary to Health come up and go, so how important is this? And I was like, if you remove this, it fucks up the whole balance. Because that's the one thing that I look to as like, it's like the one carrot in all of this versus all the other very heavy regulation. So if they remove
Keep
that, it's going to
reminding
be...
them that you can grow 15 kilograms of tobacco for everybody over the age of 18 years if you want. Make as much beer, wine, and spirits as you want, as long as you don't sell it.
Exactly.
You know? So for plants, I mean, for some of us, that's kind of ridiculous too, especially if they have to only be 100 centimeters
And
tall.
it's not
They're
an
all going to
easy-
grow sideways.
It's not an easy, cheap process by any means either, and that can cause a lot of anxiety too. So if you're using it for anxiety, for example, and someone's like, grow your own, it's like, ha, all right.
I live in the city of Toronto where the price is, I can barely get a shoebox. I can't afford to grow in my home.
Well, I mean,
There's hurdles.
landlords are going to, you know, I think you can, the definition in the Act of dwelling house includes the land surrounding. So the question I have is, well, what if you're in an apartment? I expect that many landlords are going to say you can't grow in the apartment. And it's a risky thing to, you know, having one on your balcony with no lights maybe isn't a problem, but light around.
But it is fair, recognizing that issue. It is absolutely fair if you're in a condo or you're in an apartment and the landlord, or you're in you're renting from a landlord. It's absolutely fair, and it's not for patient purposes, for medicinal purposes. It's absolutely fair for a landlord to say this could have a detrimental impact on something that I own, and I'm going to rent out.
Well, the reason that's actually, they can't really enforce that, but